think that the messaging is really confusing right now, and I think that there are rules there for a reason, and the Premier should just make a rule so that people know exactly what is required of them.
The government is leaving it up to businesses to set their own rules. Ashley Raper, ABC News.
Visitors are banned from hundreds of aged care homes across Queensland as the state tries to avoid a possible coronavirus cluster. More than 500,000 Queenslanders have now been tested since the pandemic began, including a positive result today from an international traveller who was exempt from hotel quarantine.
Queensland's latest COVID case is a man returning from Kabul through Sydney.
He tested when he arrived into Maroochydore.
Now all passengers on Friday's Jetstar flight JQ790 will need to be tested, not because the man broke the strict quarantine rules, but because of his job with an Australian embassy overseas.
And one of those exemptions is consulate staff.
Authorities say the man in his 20s flew to the Sunshine Coast, then drove to his home in Toowoomba, where he's now quarantining. Their focus is still the women who allegedly lied about returning from Victoria and the COVID cluster that could emerge as a result.
A few idiots have actually put so many lives in danger.
The Bolton Clark aged care home remains in lockdown after a nurse who dined at a Sunnybank restaurant at the same time as one of the women tested positive. All 105 elderly residents have been tested. So far, they've all returned a negative result. The 150 staff at the home are still being checked.
My wife has some relatives who are here, so it's concerning from that perspective.
We don't want people to be alarmed, but we do want to take these precautions now.
Hundreds of aged care homes in southeast Queensland are now also under the same tight restrictions. The rules apply to homes in Brisbane, Ipswich, Logan, the Redlands, Gold Coast and the Scenic Rim. As well as banning visitors, staff will be limited from working at multiple facilities and will also undergo health checks at the start of each shift. Essential contract workers will also need to wear masks. In New South Wales, the Premier has recommended masks in certain circumstances, with 12 new cases in that state today.
Such as on public transport, such as when you're buying your groceries.
Shoppers in major supermarkets in Brisbane and Logan hotspots have been given similar advice from management.
If people wish to wear masks, of course they can, but I don't think it's essential at this point in time.
For now, authorities want social distancing to remain the priority in Queensland. Brittany Klein, ABC News, Brisbane.
Health authorities in South Australia are increasingly worried at the number of new cases in the state. 2 women are the latest to test positive. One is a student who attended an Adelaide school while likely contagious. Theberton Senior College will now undergo a deep clean, and the 1,200 students, teachers and other staff who usually attend are being traced. Natasha Kalios reports.
Flanked by the Health Minister, Professor Nicola Spurrier delivers more bad news for the state.
We have, in fact, 2 new cases today. So this is very worrying for us here, and I'm sure you'll all agree with me, as we have had an increasing number of people testing positive for COVID-19 over the past week.
A positive test for a woman in her 20s has prompted the shutdown of Theberton Senior College and Roma Mitchell Secondary College. She is a close contact of a known case and was tested on Friday, but attended both schools last week while likely infectious.
Anybody who attended the school and developed symptoms will need to isolate and get tested.
The second case is a teenage girl who returned from Victoria on the 26th of July on Jetstar flight JQ774. She had symptoms before leaving Melbourne but didn't get tested until almost a week after arriving home.
The chances of her being infectious in South Australia are very, very low, but because we want to be absolutely certain in this case, we are going to continue to have her in isolation.
7 close contacts have been identified, as well as passengers on board the flight. As Victoria's outbreak worsens, tougher restrictions may also be needed here. SA's COVID Transition Committee is considering new restrictions on travellers arriving from Queensland.
We make changes as soon as they're necessary. There is a transition committee meeting which will be held on Tuesday morning, but if we need to move sooner, then that's precisely what we'll do.
Authorities say they're frustrated at the number of COVID-19 breaches still happening. In the latest, an Adelaide Hills man who returned from New South Wales has been fined $6,360 for going to the gym instead of self-isolating. Police say he has so far returned a negative test. Natasha Kalios, ABC News, Adelaide.
West Australian Premier Mark McGowan has declared the Commonwealth's decision to withdraw from Clive Palmer's High Court challenge to the state's closed border a victory for the people of WA. But constitutional experts and political analysts say it'll have little impact on the continuing case and is primarily a political fix by the Morrison government.
After repeatedly calling for the Morrison government to withdraw from the case, Premier Mark McGowan has his wish.
It's a victory for the people of Western Australia. People have spoken, the Commonwealth has listened.
In a letter to Mr McGowan, the Prime Minister cited the worsening COVID-19 pandemic in Victoria and the high level of concern in the Western Australian community for his decision. But political analysts point out another reason as well.
There's an old saying in politics that if things start to go bad, get out and get out quickly. And I think that's what Mr Morrison has aimed to do.
Polls show that Western Australians overwhelmingly want the state's border to remain closed. Here in Federal Attorney General Christian Porter's electorate of Pearce, there's little support for opening the border.
I work in aged care and I can tell you 100% I want those borders kept tightly shut.
We're a good place at the moment. Let's try and leave it there, leave the businesses open, otherwise we'll have to shut down again.
I think because of the outbreak in New South Wales and now Victoria, I think it's probably a good thing at the moment.
I've got no doubt that federal Liberals saw the opinion polls and got the opinion of West Australians and passed that on to the Prime Minister to say that the Liberal Party here is on a hiding to nothing.
Constitutional law expert Anne Toomey agrees it's a political fix and will have little bearing on the case, given the Commonwealth has already put forward evidence as to why it wasn't necessary to completely shut the state's border.
To the extent that the Commonwealth had an effect on the case, probably that's primarily already happened, and that will be taken into account by the federal court in making its decision in relation to the facts. And that material will then be used and relied upon by the High Court.
Mr McGowan is now calling on Mr Palmer to also withdraw from the case.
He's an Olympic-scale narcissist.
But in a statement, Mr Palmer said, in a democracy, all citizens have the right to take any matter to the courts. No one wants to expose Western Australians to harm from the COVID-19 virus. The High Court's decision isn't expected until September or October. Nick Perpich, ABC News.
Overseas, thousands of people in Germany have taken to the streets of Berlin to protest against coronavirus restrictions. Demonstrators claim the measures violate their rights and freedoms. The government has been easing restrictions since late April, but social distancing rules remain, as does the requirement to wear masks in shops and on public transport. Germany hasn't been hit as hard by the pandemic compared to other European countries, but the cases there are accelerating. Tropical storm Isaias is expected to be upgraded to a hurricane again as it moves towards Florida's coastline. It was downgraded after battering parts of the Bahamas with strong winds and heavy rains that knocked out power to homes. The pandemic has complicated preparations in Florida, where cases have risen dramatically since mid-June. Shelters are being prepared with lots of personal protective equipment, and scores of hotel rooms have been set aside for those with COVID.
We, in the era of COVID, I think our guidance from the state has been, look, if it's a close call, err on the side of people just hunkering down rather than sending people on the road.
Beaches, parks and virus testing sites have been closed, with 16 counties declaring a state of emergency. In a few hours' time, the SpaceX Dragon capsule is due to return to Earth, completing the first mission in 9 years to carry crew launched from American soil. These are pictures from onboard the Dragon Endeavour capsule, which will soon hit our atmosphere at speeds of more than 28,000 kilometres an hour. The re-entry is the most dangerous part of this historic journey. The mission is also a first for a private company and sees the US rejoin Russia in the space transport business.
Sending Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley back toward Earth.
After 2 months on the International Space Station, it was time to prepare the SpaceX Dragon capsule for its historic flight. the first time a privately operated spacecraft has brought humans back to Earth.
Capsule Endeavour has closed the forward hatch.
Astronauts Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley joined the 3 crew members of the ISS in May, taking part in science experiments and spacewalks.
Just all the incredible teamwork and accomplishments, with the highlights obviously being the 4 spacewalks that we worked together literally as a crew of 5.
Make mention of this very special flag. It has deep space history.
They're returning with a flag which also travelled on the last ever space shuttle mission, and a special emissary for their children.
For Jack and Theo, Tremor the Apatosaurus is headed home soon.
Thank you, Houston, and thank you, SpaceX.
With undocking from the ISS now complete, the most dangerous part of the mission comes next, the fiery re-entry into the atmosphere. After dropping out of orbit, the capsule will hit the upper atmosphere at speeds of 7.5 kilometres a second, or 20 times the speed of sound. Temperatures will reach up to 7,000 degrees Celsius, which is hotter than the surface of the sun.
Once that deorbit burn happens, you're coming home.
All going well, the Dragon capsule is due to splash down in the Gulf of Mexico early tomorrow morning Australian time. The same method used in the historic Apollo program ending in 1975. Tonight's historic re-entry and splashdown taking American spaceflight back to the future. Jonathan Flynn, ABC News.
Country South Australia is a long way from London, especially during a pandemic. But a roadside mural posted to social media has unexpectedly bridged that distance. 3 Pitjantjatjara artists have been selected to design a clothing line for London Fashion Week next year. And if all goes to plan, one of their daughters will make her runway debut.
Nestled beside a highway 3 hours from Adelaide is a mural that's really making a splash. Sisters Leah and Jasmine Brown and cousin Candace Swan painted the pipeline at Port Augusta for Reconciliation Week.
It took us 4 days to do that. Yeah, but it was fun.
A few months prior, the group transformed their artwork from a hobby to a business, selling their canvases and pots online.
We really wanted to do this for our kids so that they could, so we could be able to take them places and, you know, set them up for the future.
And it may do just that. A Facebook post about the pipeline mural caught the eye of London fashionista Anna Lavacow, who 10 years ago set up a London Fashion Week event to showcase Pacific designs.
I woke up one morning and I saw this big, massive 30-foot pipeline. You know, I was like, OMG. You know, I literally had to wipe my phone just to see if I was actually looking at the right thing.
So she commissioned a fashion line for next year's show on the spot.
They were like, Anna, we're not too sure. We've never done this before. I was like, ladies, you just painted a 30-foot pipeline in 4 days in the cold. I mean, seriously? The world is at your feet.
The looks will be